So, thank you for coming. I think it's a very exciting evening for us because there are many questions that we have been having and we would like to discuss tonight with our two guests. Before going into the introduction of our two guests here, I would like to go through some of those questions and maybe put some elements on the table. Let me read a short fragment. The first report, a proposal for a study to determine the feasibility of a simplified face recognition machine, dated 30 January 1963, aims to evaluate whether it is possible using existing technology to create a machine which can reliably solve a simplified face recognition problem. Using only pictures from a single view, example given, same angle and perspective, as well as high-resolution pictures, identify the identity or a person from a picture that is not known to the machine. So this image is integral part of this report, 1963. And it's written by the Dr. Woodrow Wilson Bledsoe and the report is intended for the CIA. And so what's interesting in this report is that Dr. Woodrow Wilson Bledsoe states that humans are unreliable observers of faces. And so I think it's one element that I would, try to put somewhere in the air, and we will come back, I think, to this quite a few times. Another piece of evidence that I would like to bring here. This is part of a documentation made by the Major Bachmann, and the Major Bachmann was the head of the passport division on the eastern side of Checkpoint Charlie. He developed a facial recognition system designed to teach the border guards to scrutinize faces and look for features that cannot be altered. The aim was to assess the authenticity of passport photos for those who were trying to leave East Berlin. And as you see, there is a very complete scrutiny of what are the components of a face, and an attempt already at that time to establish what are the face's invariants. And of course, he was not only using pen and paper, but he was also using photography at the time to provide with exercises for the guards. And this is a flashcard that was part of the equipment that the guards at the border were given. And so the questions was, is the person on the right side of the image the same as the person who is at the left side? So that's interesting to see that these questions were taking place in a very specific context, which is the context of the Cold War. It's a military context, and of course these techniques somehow have produced something that is much closer to our daily life. And so when we use a camera, most of the time there is this little rectangle that appears in the image that passes unnoticed, but it's somehow a strange legacy of this kind of practices. Interestingly, the face recognition that is already present when we capture an image is something that gives a handle to index these images. So if we go to Google to look for a picture, we can also use a series of filters that allow to classify the images, and one of these filters is the presence of a face in the picture. And this presence of the face in the picture keeps on coming back. So for instance, if you are using social media application like Facebook, you will have the application asking you over and over not only to detect faces, but also to assign names to faces. And of course, if you lose the password, this becomes a way to identify you, because you are able, A, to identify face, and you are, B, able to connect this face to somebody that you know, right? So it's interesting to see that this becomes a factor for you to be identified, when at the same time these technologies were built with the assumption that humans are unreliable observer of faces. And of course, these softwares, they do not know what a face is by chance. Basically, there are models of faces that needs to be learned by the computer. And so huge databases of, let's say, images, annotated images with the location in the image of the different features of the face, which are done manually by a whole range of people, need to be produced for this algorithm to work. So basically, when the computer recognizes a face in an image, it's also because it matches this face with a lot of other faces that it learned to recognize first. But also what's interesting, and that's something that we will hear from a bit more also tonight, is that the computer is also used back to test our ability to recognize faces. So this is a test which is 20 minutes long, if I'm not mistaken. 10 minutes long. That tests your ability to recognize faces and to distinguish the person across different screens. And computers themselves are not necessarily good at recognizing faces all the time. So because they are trained over a large quantity of data, but still not the whole image world, they still are able to make mistakes and sometimes to hallucinate the presence of a face in an image. So that's called false positives. So I have two examples here of faces detected by a computer in images that do or don't contain faces. Right? So that is basically begging for a series of questions. I think what's for us very important and really motivated first our desire to invite a discussion on the face and the digital is that the face seems to have become a feature of the digital image as color or size. So it has become like something that belongs to the image, although it's not without problems, because if we think that images have a face, it's not so clear that us as humans, we have a face. I think that's basically something that we would problematize quite a lot. And so, do we have a face, or do we slide into a face? So that's really the kind of markers and questions I would like you to have in the background of your mind when we will listen to our two speakers tonight, which I would like to introduce already now. So the first one will be Federica Biotti, who's a PhD student in cognitive neuroscience at City University of London. Her main research interests include the cognitive mechanism of face perception, face recognition, and facial emotion categorization in developmental prosopagnosia, a condition that prevents people from recognizing familiar faces. Our second speaker will be Zach Blas, Douglas is an artist and writer whose practice engages techniques and minoritarian politics. Currently, he is a lecturer in the Department of Visual Cultures at Goldsmiths University of London. Blas has exhibited and lectured internationally, recently at Whitechapel Gallery in London, ZKM Center for Art and Media in Karlsruhe, and the New Museum in New York, among others. And his recent works respond to the technological control, biometric governmentality, and network hegemony. I have to apologize for Andrew Murray, who is a lawyer and unfortunately cannot come today. He is actually very unwell, and it came as a surprise. So unfortunately, he regrets not to be with us today. So the two interventions tonight will be slightly longer than what we planned. So we'll have plenty of time to go really in detail for our two speakers' works. So maybe Federica, I give you the floor.
Thank you. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming here and for having me here tonight. So tonight I'm going to go through some of the bases of face perception and face recognition in humans. So I'm not going to talk about computers, but I'm going to talk about our computer, which is our brain. So I've been told that the audience tonight is going to be a bit diverse. So I'm going to ask you just a few questions. Can you please raise your hand if you are in the world of photography and art, just to have an idea? Okay, good. I put a lot of pictures in my presentation. And anybody in the world of technology, computer recognition?
Oh, well, technology, yes, not computer recognition.
Well, sorry, face recognition in technology.
No.
No, but well, yeah, it's interesting as well. And somebody in science at all? Good, my colleague, yeah. Great. So I hope this presentation is going to be comprehensible for all of you. I try my best to express kind of complex concepts in a kind of a human way so that everybody can understand. So bear with me if I use some kind of complex words. So, well, I have these. Cool. So, first question, what's so special about faces? So, this is not the title of my PhD thesis, but it's quite related to it. And it's more about the face that people do when I tell them what I do in life. I study faces. So, faces are actually quite interesting, and I've always been interested in the complexity of faces and the way humans can grab this complexity so well and so quickly. And a good friend of mine who is here tonight, and he was so kind to give me his picture for my presentation, is a good photographer. And when I first saw his picture, I kind of had an insight about my own interest. And so I realized that what photographers do, in particular portrait photographers, is that they try to capture the peculiarity of each face, the beauty of each individual face, in a way that can last over time. What I'm doing, on the other hand, is I'm trying to understand how humans, and so how photographers, can understand and can capture this complexity in faces, but also with imagining a bit like the brain as a camera that not only captures but also interprets and analyzes this image, influencing our behavior. So when we look at a picture like this, many information come to our vision. And so we realize that faces convey many different information about people, so we can tell something about their gender, their age, and even ethnicity just in a matter of milliseconds. But also more complex information like intentions and even traits. You might have probably heard about this new trend that you can detect some traits from these faces, like trustworthiness or something a bit more common. This is quite a debated thing in science. But definitely people do that all the time. So faces are one of the first objects that we encounter when we are born. And they're definitely one of probably the most important objects because their understanding and their perception kind of create the basis for social learning and social interaction. So it's important that babies, even a few hours old babies, are born with a kind of inherited system that allow them to orientate their attention to faces rather than to other objects, because they have to look at their mothers compared to other objects. So it's been shown, and this study has been replicated over time, that babies that are even a few hours old can preferentially select What? This, okay. Thank you. So, when babies are presented with this pattern that resembles a human face, they will orientate their attention, rotating the eyes and the head, preferentially compared to other palettes with random dispositions of the internal features or like a blank palette. And this has also been shown not just by drawing kind of rudimentary eyes and nose and mouth, but even just putting high contrast blobs in the position of the eyes and one in position of the mouth, they can still detect this configuration. So this is a nice example of what happens and why we can grab faces so quickly in the environment. So all faces share the same configuration. So all faces have two eyes above a nose and above a mouth. And our brain, it's attracted to this type of configurations in the environment. And when something like that looks like a face appears, our brain responds and interprets that as like a face-like stimulus. So this is a process that happens actually quite unconsciously, pass me this term, but then like our conscious brain tells us, oh no, that looks like a face, but it's not a face. But that's not enough to stop our system to still perceive these objects, but even like going a bit further and inferring emotional states to these objects. He's quite cute. I can definitely see that he's sad. I don't know if you can do. And so this is the same phenomenon that is behind the use of emoticons. So emoticons, of course, they're not faces. They're very simple shapes, simple sticky figures, but we still use them a lot, and we infer emotions. So why all these things happen? So definitely faces must be a special object. They must be different from other objects in our environment. And our brain perceives faces in a different way. So we say that we perceive faces holistically. And this means that when we look at faces, we don't analyze the individual features, but we fuse them together and we perceive things as a whole. And so when I ask people, this is an experiment that it's been done and we keep using it in science. When we ask people to say whether the two eyes in these two faces are identical or not identical, people find it quite hard and they take a bit of time. But look, when I disrupt the holistic processing, it's clear that these eyes are indeed identical. Okay, so this happens because the fact that the bottoms are different create illusions that there must be different identities. So we fuse them together and we perceive these faces are belonging to two different people. Another nice example is the inversion effect. We are good when faces are in their normal upright configuration. But when faces are inverted, and in this case, our perception is actually impaired. So we all can clearly see that this guy is Barack Obama. Now I'm going to ask you, is there something wrong with this picture? Maybe, yeah? Okay, so yeah, you will definitely realize that there is something wrong because I asked you if there is something wrong. Probably you are anticipating that there is something wrong. But look, when I turn the picture upside down, like the manipulation of these pictures becomes quite clear. Okay, so in the late 80s, two English psychologists, Vicky Bruce and Andy Young, developed a cognitive model of face perception. So this model was developed even before going into the brain and study the brain activity. But now we know that this model actually represents the way that our brain works and perceives faces. So as you can see, it's quite complex, and actually this is what happens inside us when we see faces. So each individual step is kind of independent from each other, and everything happens in parallel. That means that everything happens at the same time. The first step into this model is the structural encoding. And this is when we kind of analyze features like texture, pigmentation, when we analyze like shapes and shades on the face. And this is the first step in our brain where the images that we receive from our retina, which are two-dimensional, becomes three-dimensional. So at this point, we create a nice perception of the face that we are observing. So at this point, we are able at least to say whether the face is familiar or is not familiar. So if we have seen this face before or we haven't. Once we establish that, so we establish that definitely I've seen this face before, then we start connecting this face with all the information about the identity of this face. And so after this process, we can retrieve the name of this person. So a nice example about the independence of these three steps is like about some errors that we make in our everyday life, and they are quite common. So for instance, if an error comes at this stage, it's when basically we fail to recognize somebody as familiar. If the error comes at this stage, we recognize the person as familiar, but we cannot remember when we met the person, or we are not sure about who the person is. And it's a typical example of meeting the butcher on the bus. And finally, if the error comes at the last step, is when we know exactly who is that person, but we cannot retrieve his name. The tip of the tongue type of mistake. And finally, while everything is happening, another system that is kind of like independent but is working at the same time is detecting facial expressions, so the changeable aspects of faces. So you can kind of start getting an idea of how much complex this face perception is. Okay, so as we said, faces are not static. So faces are dynamic objects. They keep moving, like the inner muscles keep moving, and this gives rise to emotional expressions, but also to some state of mind and feelings. And emotion expressions is very important. It's part of our non-verbal communication. And this is actually very important for things like empathy, compassion, and all these sophisticated kind of phenomenon that our brain allows us to feel. The first one studying emotional expression was Charles Darwin, and he wrote this book, Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, where he first kind of developed the idea that the expression of emotion is universal, which means that we are born with like knowing, let's say we are born expressing emotions in a way that is not learned. So nobody teaches us how to express happiness, how to express anger. That is spontaneous. And this expression might be the same across different cultures, across different people. So it's interesting that this book has been one of the first books that used photography to illustrate instead of images. And the editor of this book, when Charles Darwin proposed the use of photography, he was a bit against, and he said this is going to be a massive flop because we cannot use photography in a book. But again, you know how how is the reality right now, and so Charles Darwin once again was like a visionary man. So the idea of universality is being brought up in time, and one of the main researcher in universality of facial expression is Paul Ekman. And Paul Ekman used this array of the 6 basic emotions, which are happiness, surprise, fear, these I think is anger, disgust, and sadness. So he was going around the United States and showing people these expressions, and he realized that everybody could recognize these expressions. So then he decided to go to China and Japan, and again, Chinese and Japanese people still could recognize these expressions. So the more skeptical in the scientific community started to say that, well, actually Chinese and Japanese, they might be contacted with American magazines, American films, so in a way they are influenced by the way that we have to express emotions. And so he decided to go to Papua New Guinea, where he studied this tribe of uncontacted people, the Fore people, and he showed them some stories. And he realized that these people actually were responding in the same way to disgusting story, happy story, sad and angry stories. And not just express the emotion that way, but they were able to recognize the expressions shown by the American people. So these allowed to create, like the universality of expression allowed us to create a code system for which for every expression we know what particular type of muscles are activated in our face. So for instance, happy face will be the combination of activation of action unit 6 and action unit 12. So every human uses these action units to express happiness. So I don't know if you've heard that there are some programs that can detect facial expression. So these programs are based on this system, this coding system. So what happens is that how these computers are better than humans, because they can detect even micro expressions. So those expressions that we all do, but they are actually not detectable by the eye. So my computers can do that. Okay, so let's go back to facial identity. We know that faces are unique. That means that they convey a unique identity, and you won't find a face that is exactly the same as another face, even in the case of same twins. So we are able, our brain is potentially able to recognize and to memorize an infinite number of faces. Okay, think of all the people that you know. Okay, and you're pretty confident that you can recognize those people. So the best model that fits reality and fits data is the model proposed by Valentine, the face-based model. So you can imagine that each face has different type of features that vary on a continuum. Some faces, like Bob's face, could vary on a continuum about like being more wide or thin, being more tall or short. So if you imagine that there are several features about how faces can vary between each other, then each face can be represented as metaphorically represented as a point in this multidimensional space where each axis of this space represents a feature. Okay, so each face has a value that refers to the value of each feature axis, and the whole face will be a direction that this face has as a combination of all his values into this multidimensional space. So let me give you like maybe an easier idea on how this multidimensional space works. So this is the example of caricatures. So how is that possible that we can still recognize people from caricatures? They're definitely not the person. They look like monsters. They're deformed, but we still can recognize those people. So this is how we can do that. So if you imagine that the real Bruce Willis lies on this continuum, on this axis, then his caricature will be on the same direction, but just a bit further away. So faces, face identities is like a direction into a multidimensional space. It's quite a complex concept, but I have like another way to explain this concept a bit better. So we can translate a computational model, so the model that we saw before, which is just theoretical, into a neural model. So how our brain might work into a multidimensional space. So this is an oversimplified model. Of course, brain is much more complex than this, but we can imagine, just in order to understand tonight, that there is like, if we imagine a dimension that is gender, like a generic dimension as gender, we can imagine that on the extreme of this continuum, there is a neural population, so a group of neurons that get activated when they see the prototypical male face. If I present a male face, what happens is that this population of neurons, the male face neurons, start pulling the perception towards a male perception, whilst the female population neurons are kind of weaker, they don't pull the perception. So we perceive this face as more masculine. So when we present a more feminine face, it happens the other way around. So the opponent population of female face neurons start pulling the perception towards their side. So let's put this into a nice experiment, into reality. How can we demonstrate this? So adaptation and After Effects are a nice kind of illusion that happens and prove this idea of this space and this opponent population of neurons that code for different features. So this space is being created by this technique that is called morphing technique, where we blend together two different images and we have different proportions of information from one or the other picture. So in this case, this picture represents the average of Bush and Obama. So this face contains 50% of Bush and 50% of Obama. So when you look this picture without having a look at the extremes, you can see that this picture contains half and a half, so that it's hard to tell whether it's more one or the other. But we can do a nice experiment that is called adaptation. So I ask you to look at Bush face for a while. So we say that you get adapted to Bush face, and then when I present you again with the average face, this will look more like Obama. Did it work? Yeah. Okay, good. So why did it happen? Okay, let's go back to our neural population. Let's imagine we have the neurons that work for Bush face and neurons that work for Obama face. Okay? So when I presented you the the real bush face, this population of neurons started working very hard because it was their face. So they started firing up. And they get fatigued, they get tired, okay? So when I presented the average face, that also contains some of the Obama information, this population wasn't tired, so it was ready, and started pulling, and so the perception got pulled towards Obama. Does it make sense at all? Okay, I try my best. Okay, students love this, by the way. Okay, let's go a bit further on something else. So, unfamiliar and familiar face recognition. This is very interesting, and it has a lot of implications in our society, especially into the justice system. So the question is, do you think that your ability to recognize people that you haven't met before is the same as recognizing somebody that you know? Okay, let me explain it better. Do you think that your perception for unfamiliar faces is as good as your perception for familiar faces? No, exactly. So a nice example of this is these experiments. And so these reminds a little bit of the police lineups, you know, when you kind of witness a crime and you have to go to the police station and they show you this man that you clearly don't know, but you have some memory of somebody that you saw, and they ask you, okay, so tell me, is this guy present in these faces? And people struggle. People find it very hard, but most of the people don't know that it's so hard. So then instead of saying, I don't know, actually I'm not that good, they pick somebody, and that person will be in trouble if it's not that person. So in this experiment, they did exactly the same. They replicated these kind of police settings. So they asked the people to tell whether the target face was present in this array, and if they thought it was present, they had to pick which person was it. So in the first case, I will help you. This guy is not present in these 10 faces. But in this case, this guy is present in these 10 faces. So do you have any idea who is this guy? Seven, okay. So some 7, some 10. Well, yeah, it's number 10. But as you see, it's not obvious, okay? Well, I will tell you something more, that these pictures have been taken the same day, just changing camera and lighting condition. So it's not that this picture was taken 10 years before, okay? So this is quite important. But well, when I show you this array of picture, how quickly can you tell that this guy is familiar, and you also know that this is Bill Clinton? But if you look at each individual face, his face changes a lot. It varies a lot from one picture to the other in terms of rotation of the face, in terms of also age, like look the difference between these two, and in terms of light, expressions, so many changes, but you don't have any problem at all to tell that this guy is Bill Clinton. So this suggests that we might treat familiar faces and unfamiliar faces in a different way. Okay, so, and how do we treat them in a different way? The thing is that when we look at people that we don't know, when we look at pictures of unfamiliar faces, we rely our perception on pictorial codes. Pictorial codes refer to the actual picture. So they refer to the luminance of the picture, to the type of camera, to all these things that refer to pictures. But when we have to recognize somebody that we know, we rely our perception on structural codes. And structural codes are kind of abstract representations in our memory that refer to a particular face. So each encounter with a face, with each new exemplar of that face, will enrich our representation. And this process is called image averaging, okay? So it's basically what this is happening in our brain. So we see many pictures and many images of the same person, and then we create a sort of an average of that person. So some factors factors that might impair unfamiliar recognition are like differences in viewpoints and expressions, or this is a nice video. So this shows that this is the same actress, but look how her identity changes based on like the sources of light. So based on how light illuminates this woman. And finally, negation. It's something that affects face recognition. So it's hard to tell, well, it's a bit harder to tell who this man is. Any guess? Yeah. But well, you can see that it's much easier when it's not negated. And finally, inversion. So you might recognize him, you might not, but when I turn the face upside down, it's not Damon. And finally, distinctiveness. So we remember faces that are more distinctive for us compared to faces that are more in the average. This is very personal, but we might have in our brain an idea of what is an average, which is, like, of course, the average of all the faces that we have seen in our life. And also caricaturing improves recognition. Finally, and I'm concluding now, I'm going to talk very quickly about when face recognition is impaired. So we can imagine that face recognition ability, we can imagine like is a continuum where the majority of population collocates in the middle, so they are kind of okay. And then we have a little subgroups of people that are incredibly good. They are called super recognizer. The Metropolitan Police has a unit that is called super recognizer unit, where these people are actually better than machine. And then we have developmental prosopagnosia, a subset of people that cannot recognize faces. So what is developmental prosopagnosia, which is the condition that I'm studying right now? So this is a lifelong condition, which means that they were born with this condition, and affecting the ability to recognize familiar faces. This condition is not associated with general intelligence, so it's a bit like dyslexia. It's not associated with intelligence, and affects people with normal vision and without brain lesions. It's quite surprising that the prevalence rate is actually quite high, so it's like 2.5% of population. So there are different measures to diagnose this condition. So we developed like a questionnaire, and then there are some computer tests. And the most famous one that Nicola showed before is this test that is called the Cambridge Face Memory Test, where people see different faces, they have to learn these faces, and then these faces are presented again, and they have to pick these faces among unfamiliar faces. So some of the features of this condition is hard to recognize people when they are met out of their usual context. So they even struggle to recognize their partner if they meet them out of the street and not at home. It's hard to follow movies where characters look alike, so The Departed is actually the worst nightmare for people with prosopagnosia because they have no idea on which one is DiCaprio, which one is Matt Damon. They have no idea. And of course, it's hard to work in places where people are required to wear uniforms. So a nice example comes from this dad. He came to do my experiments, and he told me this story that when he goes to pick up their kids at school, their kids know that they have to go to their dad because he cannot pick which one are his kids from the other boys. And there are so many other examples like this. So, and finally, this is like a research that I conducted last year. So we always say prosopagnosia affects spatial identity, but we saw from the model that yes, these systems are independent, but actually they all arise from a common structural encoding, okay? So I wonder whether also emotional expression might be impaired in this condition. So how did I investigate this? So when you go to people with prosopagnosia and you ask directly to them, do you have problem recognizing emotional expression? They always say, no, I'm totally fine with that. My problem is just with identity. And then if you read literature so far, you will find the same. You will find that, yeah, they didn't find any differences. So they must be quite good with expressions. But then we thought, how about they're actually not aware of that? And actually, the way that they don't recognize the expressions reflects more in awkward situation, because nobody's going to tell you, oh, you know, I was angry before, you didn't realize that. It's just you think that that person is just a bit less empathic and maybe doesn't care about you, okay? But some people told me, oh, you know, actually my wife sometimes told me that I'm not really good at reading her expressions. So we decided to make this task a bit hard. And we used again this morphing technique. What we did was morphing together faces with different expressions. So if you look at this picture, this array, so for instance, let's take anger and happiness, this face contains 20% of happiness and 80% of anger. And this face in the middle is a very ambiguous face because it contains exactly the same proportion of happiness and anger, so it's very hard to tell which expression is depicted. And the same here and here. And what we found was a big difference, so a significant difference. So people with prosopagnosia were good when they had to depict the extreme expression, but where we moved into the 30-40%, so these more ambiguous expressions, they couldn't recognize them. And so this kind of opens more questions, and it's kind of interesting for me to go a bit further. So, okay, so this is the end of my talk. I'd like to thank Richard Cook, who is my supervisor, and Zara Senek is another PhD student that works with us, and he does research on other race effects, which is another word of face perception. And then, of course, City University London and Travel with Faces, which is my organization. And if you want to have a look at the website, it's very interesting. You can find lots of interesting stories about prosopagnosia. And finally, the Cognitive Neuroscience Research Unit at City University. And I just want to do a bit of advertise. So this Saturday, in this same room, me and other two colleagues are going to run a workshop from 2 to 5, right? So if you want to look some of the technique that we use when we study face perception and body perception, you can come and we will explain everything. And thank you to the Photographers Gallery as well. So, yeah.
Okay, hi everyone, my name is Zach. Maybe I should say a little bit about my background so you understand why I'm jumping between artistic practice and philosophy. So I am an artist, but I have a PhD in critical theory and philosophy, and my practice is very much rooted in doing theoretical research. But I'm going to talk to you about work that I've been doing for over the past 6 years. Artistically, all of the artwork that deals with faces, and I'll be speaking about biometrics, is complete, and I'm in the process of finishing 2 books right now that specifically deal with biometrics and artistic practice. Okay, so here we go. I understand that I may be required to provide a record of my fingerprints and a photograph of my face, biometric data, as part of my application. If I refuse to do so, my application may be treated as invalid and, if so, will not be considered further. That's the United Kingdom Visas and Immigration. So, in the spring of 2015, I was living in the United States. I was a professor there at SUNY Buffalo, and I accepted a teaching position at Goldsmiths College here in the UK, and as a United States citizen, was quickly directed to commence my visa application, which was really fascinating for me because I had been researching biometrics for so many years, and suddenly I found myself directly implicated in them. So, because the Goldsmiths immigration staff informed me that a new visa scheme was underway in the UK, that it actually had just changed the month before I had to submit my visa application. And it would be within this new visa scheme that I would enter the country through a new biometric program. So as part of this application, I was given notification that I would need to go to a biometric enrollment center. And as you can see here, it says, this is to enable the collection of my biometrics unless I am bio-exempt. Now, we can talk about this later, but this is a term I've kind of become really obsessed with very recently. This idea of unless you are bio-exempt. And if you look through other UK governmental documents on this written by Home Office, you'll also notice that bio-exempt, you would think it more practically refers to people with certain kinds of disabilities, so amputees, people who have damaged fingerprints, but also in the Home Office documentation, there'll be a switching between bio-exempt or exempt from control. And anyway, I find this like an incredibly impossible and fantastical category, but I was certainly not bio-exempt, and because of that, I had to go to this building in Manhattan, which is where the Department of Homeland Security is located, and I had to go here because the United Kingdom outsources all of its biometric aggregation needs for US citizens to a third-party private company that's housed in this building. So once I made my way through this building and I found the biometric enrollment center, it looked something like this, many different stations like this. And once I was there, a woman silently took digital photographs of my face from different angles, and then after putting on white protective gloves that looked like she was about to perform surgery on me, she took my fingers and scanned them very carefully, one by one, over a sensing pad. And then I got to watch as my fingerprints visualized in this biometric software, and they were captured, verified, and saved, and shared with both the US and the UK. And then, some months later, I arrived here in London, and the Goldsmiths Immigration Policy Advisors emailed me to inform me that my BRP, the official title, the Biometric Residence Permit, was ready to collect. And so on the cards back here is a small chip, right? A small chip is implanted that stores, among other information, all of my biometric data, and due to this, there's no signature required on the card. Now, as an artist, I like to kind of zoom into this chip and speculate and imagine like what my facial data is doing, even though I can't really see it. And I think, I like to think it's doing something like this. So when I started doing this research in 2011, it was pre-Edward Snowden and kind of an obsession with global surveillance, but after those revelations happened, everyone wanted to talk to me about the work, the artwork I was making around surveillance and privacy, and I found that really fascinating because actually those weren't the way I was thinking about this research at all, and I was much more captivated by this idea of capture. And for me, I take this idea of capture from an information scientist named Phil Agra, who is very fascinating character. He wrote some early texts on critiquing facial recognition evaluation in public spaces, and then some years ago, he taught at Information Science School in UCLA in California. He mysteriously disappeared. I think he was found, but I'm not sure. But anyway, he made this argument that what we're living in today, which we often refer to as surveillance, he argues it would be more specific and useful if we term this capture. And for him, capture emphasizes things like the algorithmic computational process of how much technologies that contribute to surveillance, how they work. But he's also trying to draw our attention to the fact that technologies, in order to capture a face, capture a finger, right, capture an eye, there have to be actual algorithmic grammars that get written and programmed into machines in order for the capturing to work. Okay, I'll review some examples of that in a second, but maybe I should also just clarify the definition of biometric. So biometric technologies are technologies that aim to basically get some kind of core identity from a human body. And they do this through things like facial recognition, which is what I will focus on, or other things like iris recognition, hand geometry, and even what are called softer traits like race and gender. And importantly, the kind of point about biometrics is that by calculating, by digitally calculating at the surface of the body, right, only kind of digitally calculating at the surface of the body, you're able to arrive at some core truth about a person. So, okay, some capture examples. So here we have a digital camera that seems to kind of perfectly have recognized the faces of this white heteronormative family. And I think the question to ask here, which is a simple one, and I think Federica covered a lot of terrain with thinking about this, is that when you ask the question, how does the camera know to draw boxes around these faces? Well, there's a very simple point that needs to be made first, and it's because human beings have written capture algorithms that get put into these machines to detect faces. Okay, so it seems to work simple enough. We can move to another example, such as smile detection. And I think to the end of your presentation about these kind of middle zones between happy or sad, etc. This is often what I think about smile detection because, okay, the camera, same thing. How does the camera know you're smiling? Because, you know, what if you smile in a sense that actually looks more like a grimace? And I have two friends that definitely do that. I would think the smile detection, you know, might not work. So again, it's an interesting question to ask because it has to be very kind of rigidly determined in terms of algorithmics. You know, so much will constitute a smile and so much won't. Again, maybe simple enough, but it gets more complicated. So here's an example of blink detection, and here you have a woman that's being asked if she blinks, and clearly she is not blinking. So this is a moment where the capture algorithm is not working correctly. And in this moment where the capture algorithm is not working correctly, you know, perhaps we could make some extrapolations on this. So for one, we could say, which has often been the case with certain of these algorithms, is that maybe the faces that were analyzed and databased in order to develop the blink detection algorithm heavily relied on Caucasian faces. So again, what you can extract from here is that even though these technologies, we assume them to be incredibly neutral and objective, there can be certain human biases built into the technological architecture of the machine, right, in this case, a racial bias. But here's another one. So here you have 3 white appearing individuals with a black man in the background, right, and you have all white appearing individuals getting successfully detected, and even the white face on the t-shirt, right, the black man is unsuccessfully detected. And there have been instances of this in the early kind of stages of biometric development where, for example, the Connect, there was an instance with this where dark skin is often difficult or problematic to detect with some of these technologies. So again, just an example of the biometric's ability to recognize being calibrated, particularly for white skin. So, okay, I mean, these might seem kind of silly, simple examples, but it gets really complicated when you actually think about how biometric technologies and the way biometrics approaches identity and how it treats and catalogs people and expects them to match and be read get put into governmental programs all around the world. So it's like every year a new country is implementing full-blown biometric citizenship, which gets put into passports. And biometrics are still today, for some time now, the world's #1 border security technology. And so for over 10 years, I've been making work that deals with kind of emerging technologies and specifically thinking about those from queer or feminist perspectives. And there's been a growing number recently of feminist, queer, transgender scholars that are working on contemporary issues around surveillance. And one of those is a woman named Shoshana Magnet. And Shoshana Magnet has a book called When Biometrics Fail. And through a lot of really in-depth kind of specific analyses of examples of biometric technologies being implemented by governments around the world, she's able to successfully argue that biometrics often fail to recognize a very broad set, you could say, of minoritarian populations, whether it's, for example, instances of Asian women's hands failing to successfully authenticate, or with the example I have here, which has been very prominent in the United States, transgender people when their bodies are getting analyzed in 3D body scanners at airports. So there are many documented instances of this when what is assumed to be a woman or a man enters a body scanner and then a genital anomaly is detected, which doesn't necessarily match the assumed gender on a state-based mode of identification. And in the US, these people immediately get detained on pre-terrorist suspicion. So the point is that actually, when biometrics fail, there can be kind of serious political consequences at stake. So the first work I made thinking around all of this is a work called Face Cages, which takes its title from another concept that was laid out in Shoshana Magnet's book, where she described biometrics as a cage of information. And I found that really evocative as an artist, and I wanted to make something in the line of kind of critical dystopian fiction. And this idea of a cage of information, it made me think of two things. On the one hand, right, we often today encounter biometrics or different types of face calculation like this in this kind of fun way. The aesthetics is very minimal, it's colorful, it's implemented in a lot of consumer technology. But of course, biometric development and innovation is first and foremost for militarization, policing, and criminalization. So I wanted to find a way to kind of think about this idea of the cage of information within that context. So, right, the cage can very easily, clearly evoke something like policing and prison, but for me, it also evoked this idea of disembodiment, of actually the way that biometrics calculate and abstract identification. It doesn't necessarily, it's not the exact same thing as the human body. So the first thing I did, I collaborated with 3 other artists, and we used different biometric software to actually get diagrams of our faces, like you just saw on the previous slide. And then we would use 3D modeling to basically take those models, not change the measurements, but make them 3-dimensional. So this is a 3D model that you're looking at. And this was another one, so just different kinds of software to get kind of different iterations and variations. And then those diagrams, these biometric diagrams, were turned into metal face cages. So they were actually fabricated in metal through mostly through a 3D printing process in metal, so they would kind of keep the exact measurements. And after some experiments before I made them in metal, basically how this work ended up materializing was something like this. So these are actually 4 videos. These are 4 performance videos for the camera, where each of these people are wearing their own biometric diagram, and the prompt of these performances, which are just these still, basically portraits, that are video, is to just wear this face cage until you can't bear it any longer. Because what was really interesting is that you would think that once this mode of biometric calculation has happened, that it seems, at least in the computational realm, when you're looking at it on the computer screen, it seems to kind of perfectly calculate the face. But when you actually take those measurements and turn them into something physical, what we discovered is that actually they don't fit the face very well at all, and in some instances they're actually quite painful to wear. And you can't really see in mine, but like there are these inner spikes that are basically, I feel like, a millimeter away from stabbing my eyes. And then this work premiered, a smaller version of this work premiered in 2015 at Transmediale in Berlin. So this is one component of the artwork, and the other component began with this. With a set of scientific studies that began claiming you could successfully determine someone's sexual orientation through quick, rapid exposure to their faces. And I had wanted to do something with faces for a very long time, and then when these studies came out, it just kind of seemed like my way into this as an artist. So first, these studies started to get reported around 2007, and they were being conducted at top-tier Research One universities in the United States. They've since carried over to the United Kingdom and continental Europe. And basically what happens in these studies is that people running these studies will show cropped faces, just photographs of cropped faces, and then they will present them to test subjects for a certain amount of milliseconds, sometimes even almost at the subliminal threshold. They will show faces like this, or they'll just show little bits of cropped faces. And I can talk about this more later if you want more details, but interestingly, they banned what they deemed any kind of cultural marking. So you couldn't have, an earring or like a tattoo or glasses, etc. And then basically, these faces were flashed, both men and women, and people were asked, are these people gay or straight? And the studies seem to conclude time and again that people have an innate ability to actually determine sexual orientation through this kind of rapid exposure to the face. Now, what was really kind of striking to me about this study is that no biometric machine is being used here. It's just people sitting in a room looking at faces getting flashed to them. But yet, the face is still being treated biometrically. I think that's what's really amazing about these studies. It's that this idea of just getting exposed to the surface quickly, and you're able to have kind of a guaranteed calculation of what might lie beyond the surface of a body. And the articles are actually quite spectacular to read, and I really love the end of this one. This is one of the kind of primary studies where they say, which actually, Federica, you touched on, this idea of, they're talking about ability to still determine whether someone is gay or straight even when you're exposed to an upside down face. And they say, in light of these findings, it is interesting to note the popular desire to learn to read faces like books. And considering how challenging it is to read a book upside down, it seems that we read faces better than we read books. So, you know, what always struck me with these studies is that none of the people conducting them ever kind of talked about why are they doing this research to begin with, to what end, and for me, they basically scientifically validated something that I grew up hearing a lot in the United States, which is the phrase gay face or fag face. And if you do a Google image search for gay face or fag face, you'll get something like this. But I think what's really important to note about all of these images, it's not necessarily that everyone up there is gay or identifies as homosexual. It's a very particular way, I think, of interpreting, you know, femininity in male facial features, or a normative way of understanding femininity in male facial features. And you know, this is not necessarily to completely discredit the idea amazing, of fag face, or of like, you know, this kind of idea of like gaydar, this kind of subcultural practice that's existed for a long time in queer culture. But what's really interesting is that these studies were not really on the fringes of research. They were published in the New York Times. And you know, I think what's really amazing is that it's about taking this practice of gaydar and, you know, turning it into kind of a guaranteed science. Where it's like, you know, when you think about how gaydar works in queer subculture, you don't see cropped faces floating in a void for a certain amount of milliseconds before you make a decision about sexual orientation. They're usually attached to a body. Okay, so that said, this kind of research became part of the companion project, art project, which was called Facial Weaponization Suite, and this was a series of mask-making workshops I did in basically in Europe, Mexico, and the United States. And the premise of this work was I would run these very long workshops that would last for at least a month, and get to know people, think about biometrics, and learn about biometrics in local contexts, global ones as well. And then at a certain point, I would scan everyone's face using a Kinect to get a 3D model of everyone's face. And then I would take that data and bring it together, not average it out, but bring it together to get some kind of, I guess you could say, collective composite of everyone's face. And for me, this was really kind of thinking or wanting to make work in connection to what was happening with a lot of social movements at the time. So thinking about social movements and masking, I was really kind of taken by that. Not only, so for example, you could think of Pussy Riot, Solidarity Protest, you could think of Anonymous as a very obvious example, but I like the Zapatistas, the autonomous indigenous group of people that live in southern Mexico and Chiapas, who they all wear the black balaclava. And the Zapatistas have a really beautiful saying when they're making their demands to the Mexican government. You know, they say, we hide our faces so that we can be seen. So there's something about masking in social movements and protests that's not just about an individual disappearing act, but it's also about refusing to cohere, refusing to be kind of recognizable on the terms of the state. And within the theoretical research I was doing at the time, there was one particular theorist that I thought really captured this sentiment of a critique of biometrics and not really wanting identity to be able to become something that's can exist as fully calculable or something that can be, you know, literally disembodied, right? Because biometrics, right, it's data. It gets disembodied from you and circulates globally in networks. And that philosopher is also a poet, who's the late Caribbean thinker Edward Glissant. And Glissant contributed a lot of amazing ideas to the 20th century, but perhaps one of his most inspiring was this idea of opacity. And this is one of his most famous lines from his writing. We clamor for the right to opacity for everyone. And I mean, you can probably get a quite simple glimmer of what this means, but for Glissant, he's writing in this Caribbean context, he's thinking about colonialism, And he really argued that when you engage with another person, you have to let an element of opacity exist within that person. You have to kind of let them have this like unknowability, and for him that was the foundation of an ethics. You can't assume when another person is standing in front of you that they become completely knowable or fully transparent based on your knowledge and your expertise. And what's really amazing about Glissant is that he has this really breathtaking critique of transparency. But for Glissant, transparency means, it doesn't mean like the transparency of WikiLeaks and Anonymous, exposing governmental corruption. He means, for him, transparency is forms of universalism. So when you take a mode of universalism, and he talks about the Enlightenment a lot, when you take a mode of universalism and put it, kind of force it onto another person, somehow that person magically becomes transparent, right? And for him, he's critiquing this and pushing against this. And I think what's interesting about his definition is that, you could say that for him, biometrics would be this kind of transparency. And I think the important thing is that's kind of the dream drive of biometrics. It certainly is not that yet. But that's exactly what biometrics tries to do to another human. So yeah, here are some of the protest examples that I was talking about. You have the Zapatistas here. Those are Black Bloc protests and Pussy Riot. So anyway, thinking about trying to figure out how to engage with this as an artist and make something, I wanted to make masks, and so I did that based on this 3D aggregation. And this was the first mask I made, and it was responding to these gay face studies. And it was supposed to be kind of this funny mocking of those studies, because if those studies claim that you can successfully determine if one person is gay or straight, or if one person is gay, well then wearing 20 gay faces at the same time, might make you extremely super gay. But the way that they're aggregated and brought together, you end up getting this kind of illegible, abstract composite. And the point of that is that the practical takeaway here is that the masks, when you wear them, they're not recognizable as human faces to biometric facial recognition machines. So anyway, I made this mask, and then I had no idea what to do with it at first. And I was living in Los Angeles at the time, and I got together with a group of people as kind of just an experimental thing, and walked around LA. But LA is the weirdest city I've ever lived in, and no one really noticed 20 people walking around in Hollywood wearing these kinds of masks. So it took some time, and then I ended up collaborating with the One Archives, which is the largest LGBTIQ archive in the world. It's located in downtown Los Angeles. And they invited me to do this event at Gay Pride in West Hollywood in 2013. And of course, in true LA style, they put the experimental art in a parking lot. So this is on the ground level of the West Hollywood Public Library. And what we did here was we actually recreated these gay face studies, and we would scan people's faces and tell them if they had gay face or not, kind of as a way to just do this kind of absurdist way of reperforming these calculations. But then, I didn't really know what was going to happen at the time, but this project expanded into other masks that try to kind of think through other aspects of biometrics. So I collaborated with an artist, Ricardo Dominguez, who's based in San Diego, and we did this work around thinking about blackness as something that fails to get recognized, but also the kind of aesthetic trope of blackness in militant protests, did kind of public performances. There was a third mask that dealt with questions around feminism that was made in New York at IBEAM, which is an art and technology center. And then the fourth mask was commissioned by MOAC, which is a contemporary art museum in Mexico City. And this one was kind of mostly thinking about US-Mexico relations, the heavy policing of the border there through biometric technologies. And what we ended up doing there was we did a mask procession throughout big chunks of Mexico City. And we, while we were, because in Mexico there's a culture of mask protest and, of mask procession and kind of thinking about mourning and death. So with this, we took actually another term for Shoshana Magnet, this idea of biometric sorrow, to actually think about biometrics' connection to policing, how it contributes to death between the US and Mexico because of the way the border is policed. And yeah, on that cheery note, that's the end of that project. So I think I'm going to stop there for now, but you can be in touch with me if you want. Okay, thanks everyone.
So maybe before opening the questions to the audience, what I would like to propose is, maybe you have questions to ask to each other, because I think that there are lots of things that have been addressed from different directions, also different positions. So maybe we should, start with that. So is there?
Yeah, if you have any.
Sure. I mean, I really enjoyed your presentation. I guess I'm curious. Have you done research on the machine side of things? And I mean, that's something really interesting. I really liked hearing the human side of this, because I think the question of recognition. It's not the exact same question. If it's a machine versus if it's a human. Phew.
Yeah. So I've never conducted studies on machines, so I know very little about how machine technology works in face recognition. But it's interesting that there are similar processes, I think, in machine recognition and human recognition. What I found interesting from your presentation is that you kind of protest a little bit about these generalization of technology, the way they treat faces as general. And you saw from my presentation that actually something that we also do. And of course we don't do that because of prejudice, but because that is a useful system. So the way that you categorize face is useful because it allows you to recognize faces more efficiently. So for instance, about the other race effect. So the fact that we are better recognizing people that shares our ethnicity, okay? And so this effect has been shown that comes from a few exposition, a little exposition that you have with people from another race. Okay, so people that there was a study that people were born in Taiwan and they were adopted in France, and they experienced the same race effect. So basically, they were less able to recognize Taiwan faces compared to Caucasian faces. So probably what you're saying in the system, the computational system that recognizes faces probably will need to be exposed with more faces of a certain type, a certain race. So maybe these systems are based on Caucasian faces, as you suggested, and it's true. But the problem is that when if you want to have a very efficient system, so this is what I think, but I'm not an expert in technology, I assume that you need lots of pictures of images and inputs from one certain category, and your system becomes very efficient because the average it has is it's circumscribed within that category. If you input some other different categories into these algorithms, I think it gets the recognition gets a bit less sophisticated. So I agree, a city like London or the United States of America, where people have different type of faces and ethnicity, you need to have a system that doesn't discriminate anybody, if you can use the word discriminating to a technology system. But definitely, I think maybe in China they are developing systems where the norm is a Chinese face compared to Caucasian, so probably those systems will be less able to categorize and recognize Caucasian faces. So this is what I think in terms of how can you translate human recognition and machine recognition, that it's based basically on averaging and generalizing faces. So yeah, this is what, sorry. That was kind of an answer. It's connected a bit to what I thought during your presentation, that we have different goals in what we do. So you are interested in the in the individual as a unique face. So, but in science, it doesn't really work like that. Unfortunately, you need to generalize. So you need to have a norm, kind of an idea, general idea of what is a face. And unfortunately, I talk about distinctiveness. Unfortunately, there are certain faces that are different from the norm, okay? But basically, science works on these. You need to generalize, to have reliable data, and to kind of build technology and to progress in research. You cannot analyze all the billions of people on the planet, so you need to base on...
No, that's actually a really helpful point. You're right, because, I guess, one thing I could say to that, it's one thing to kind of calculate the face in a kind of classical, anthropometry move, just kind of like calculating and indexing the face. But then, what becomes problematic with biometrics is there's one other step. There's calculating the face to actually then make some kind of claim on a person. So there's an assumption that, however the surface gets calculated, then that gives some kind of core truth about another person. And this is why, for example, the transgender example really complicates that. Now, it makes perfect sense to me what you're saying scientifically, about, the reason for kind of beginning from the norms, and of course there's going to be outliers. But then, and I'm speaking about biometrics specifically because they're also a mode of governance today, right? They're a mode of governance, and that becomes a political question. Then it's like, okay, if you create a mode of identity like that from which to govern populations, and certain people are excluded from that, and then they get treated, as terrorists, or they get, unfair, like there's so many examples of this, I could just kind of give you a laundry list, but I think, it becomes like another kind of question, another kind of problem. It's not just it's not even necessarily, for me, it's not even necessarily about a better model of calculation. It's just an assumption that, there's an assumption, that the better you calculate, the more you're going to get to the truth of someone, and I don't know if I believe that. What I would say, actually, this is really interesting. So when the biometric industry really began booming, which first happened in the United States, it was for very specific reasons. And it was after 9/11, and the US government were deeply frustrated because they had video footage of the 9/11 hijackers. And so there became this lament. We actually had the surveillance footage. If only we could have preemptively identified them. So a lot of the initial research actually was about how to preemptively identify a terrorist face. And this was a lot of the logic kind of pushing research. How can you calculate a terrorist face? Well, how that gets calculated in practice is called racial profiling.
Well, yeah, it depends. If you have already like an idea of what, like if you have a database with information about those specific people, like it's not profiling, but it's kind of individuating people that you already know because you already have as a suspect in your system. So saying you already have some idea, because some of these terrorists, I'm not sure about the 9/11, but as we saw in Paris as well, they were already in this, like they were already suspects, and they were like actually were checking on them, okay, even if then they could do whatever what they did. But especially I think it was in Belgium, probably the attack at the airport. So there are footages of these people. So if you have a system that kind of like detects these faces in the airport and tells you, oh look, these people are in the airport right now. I don't think that we should only relate on computers. That's not the way. We are very at the beginning of this, and I'm talking about like a non-expert in technology because I don't do technology, so I'm trying to. But I think that we should use it as a complementary tool in our hands because we saw human face perception has limitations, and so machine learning and machine-like technology has limitations. So probably we should try to find a way to combine the two abilities, the two different types of our ability and work together. But I don't think it prompts to profiling. It might, but also it depends the use of technology as for everything. So it depends the use that every single individual does. Like you can have a knife and either chop an apple or like stab your dinner mate. So it's not the knives are bad. It's just how you use them. And so, yeah, probably.
May I?
Yeah, of course.
Because I was surprised when I was seeing the two actually presentations about the role of photography. That's
Yeah, let's go to the topic.
yeah. Well, it's because, for instance, in your talk, most of the experiments you're making are not with actual faces, but with photographs.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm really wondering about this connection about when we do study faces and face recognition, do we study faces or do we study images of faces? And is there any difference, for instance, with people who have a condition of not recognizing real faces and recognizing faces in pictures, or the opposite? So for me, that's it's a very crucial question. You know, whether we take sort of photography for granted as a sort of transparent. We go to this question of opacity and transparency, but this time maybe with the medium. Like, is a photograph a sort of, you know, transparent representation of reality? And if not, how do you problematize this question in the experiments you're making?
Yeah. So this is a very good point, and actually, photographs of faces are not faces. Okay, and that's clear. So. Faces, as we saw, they move, they're complex, they're three-dimensional, and you cannot reproduce these entirely in pictures. So this is a big problem in my research. And the answer why we don't use videos or why don't we use real faces is quite boring and simple, is that it's much harder. So when you are a scientist, you have to control so many variables that your stimuli needs to be perfect. So when you use, like, using videos of faces make it much harder because you input different variables. So definitely my type of results extend somehow to pictures. But still, when we look pictures, we detect faces, we still see faces, we still are able to recognize those faces if you use familiar pictures, famous people, or to match picture. And all these systems have been proved by also like neuroimaging studies. So basically, like the same areas in the brain activate when you see pictures of faces and when you see real faces. So if there are differences, these differences are kind of little. So in terms of my research, I will still use pictures because it's simple and it produces better data. But of course, there is always a limitation into like translating my research in reality. So yeah, it's a good point, definitely.
To comment or?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, actually, I have a question for you. So I have a sneaking suspicion where the title of this panel comes from, which is taking us into philosophical terrain. And I'm assuming sliding into a face comes from Deleuze and Guattari, the French post-structuralist philosophers, from their chapter on faciality, where they talk about how, you know, one is not born with a face, one slides into a face. And I think, you know, maybe it's another element. I mean, I touched on opacity a little bit. I mean, another reason I've been super interested in the face is because it actually has a really rich history in 20th century philosophy. And you could go to someone like Levinas, Emmanuel Levinas, right, who wrote this like really, I mean, still much celebrated today, philosophy of the face, and he was an ethical philosopher. And his kind of whole argument is that the face is the site where ethics happens for humans. And, you know, interesting, I mean, it's a very provocative claim, and it's often quite religious, you know, when you kind of like get down into it, where he makes the argument that, you know, the face is where, when you encounter the face of another, this is what he says, when you encounter the face of another, the first thing that face says to you is, don't kill me. So he like actually kind of describes like every ethical encounter with the face is about this kind of, you know, struggle between this implicit will of another human to kill and the need to kind of keep a certain alterity within the face to not violate that. I mean, I don't know, that's gonna take us in a different terrain, but maybe let's bring it back to sliding into a face, and I was just wondering if you want to say something about the philosophical side, or maybe even just your philosophical interests.
Okay. Well, for me, what was striking in this passage of Deleuze and Guattari was how they have a very, let's say, negative understanding of the face. For them, the face is authority. So basically, when you're in front of everything can turn into a face. It's something that suddenly constitutes you as a subject, and you're basically, it's very different, for instance, from a head. A head is something that has not this kind of link to identification and to this, interpellation that the face is making. But what I really loved into the text, and I think is for me really present in, let's say, the practice of face detection, is to understand that the face is something that is really hard to point. I think there is a lot of work that is made for a face to function as a face. It doesn't function as a face by itself, and as we see most of the time, you need a lot of work for the face detection algorithm to not hallucinate faces everywhere. So for me, that was my interest in bringing you together. Is what it's really like having this impression that you slide in and out the face all the time, and I had the impression that was really perhaps a common interest, although there are many differences also in your approach. But I think that's
definitely. I love sorry, really. I love your work when you I think it's the weaponizing phase. The fact that you're actually doing the opposite of what this technology is doing. So you are anti-averaging faces in a way that it kind of doesn't help recognition, but it kind of disrupts recognition. So I think that's quite interesting from my perspective. And I had no idea that you could get such horrible bubble with just faces. They're so beautiful, and you transform them in something not very. But in terms of artwork, it's very interesting. Yeah, I like that.
As we're running out of time, maybe I would like to give the opportunity to somebody to ask a question. So there is a mic. Yeah.
I'm sorry to know the tone of this a little bit, but maybe not, to do with photography and also expression. Why is it that when people take selfies, they have this expression of absolute shock that they put on, even though it's the ultimate in design self-portrait? Is there anything to do with that? You talked about the 6 expressions, but that's the 7th, the selfie.
It's part of evolution, or maybe devolution in this case. I don't know. Well, I don't know. I think, that's definitely not an emotional expression. It's probably some kind of aesthetic trend that, I don't know, makes faces look nicer for certain people. It might not be the case for everybody, but it definitely. Well, let's say that it doesn't have any evolutionary meaning for our species. So I'm assuming that we will not we will not transmit these traits into the next generation. Hopefully, they will change it.
I just want to pick up on some of the things from Zach, your talk about militarization and control, and the way that biometrics are used in policing, and with the rise of neo-fascism and the events that we're all very familiar with, it feels to me there's an urgency in your work in terms of resisting being documented, being measured, resisting, I'm afraid, some of your research, because of this mapping of the human face and how that's translated very directly into the politics of control, particularly thinking about Trump's kind of promise to deport so many people from the US. I feel like there's an urgency for us to be doing everything that we can to resist biometrics and to make it difficult to be measured in kind of solidarity, I suppose. And I was thinking about the relationship between Facebook and the CIA, and Facebook asking us all to do this machine learning training in terms of tagging people, because that helps make their algorithm better at facial recognition. And I think maybe we should all go away and tag people as much as we can, and tag people of the wrong ethnicity as much as we can. Do you know what I mean? And just try and create as much confusion as possible. It just feels, I mean, going back to your point that you made about the knife not being necessarily bad, I don't know that I wholeheartedly agree, because I think it's a question of power, and if you can basically create an algorithm that can map every type of person, then that is, just kind of terrifying power. And I just wanted to throw that back, really.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, thanks for that. I mean, certainly, it's what a lot of this work, actually developed out of from a very early period. It was, that's why I was saying I was so much more interested in capture than surveillance, because for me, capture actually allows you, or if you focus on that, it's about thinking about how identification gets technically standardized.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not saying this works perfectly, but the dream drive for biometrics is to have, an algorithmic standard at the technical global scale. And then, that evokes a whole kind of like cluster of really complicated political problems. And then I think it's this question of course, on the one hand, research like this getting done. I mean, of course, we can calculate the surface of the face, but then, that's why I was saying the next step is the political question. Actually, like, what are the larger political ramifications of that research, and how does it get taken up and used? And I think the point about you made about the rise of fascism, I think in the US, some of the critiques around the NSA and the kind of, we don't really need to worry about necessarily all this data, including biometric data being aggregated at us. It's only going to be a problem if some kind of fascist comes into power. And now you do have all of this kind of, massive amounts of biometric data and other kinds of data that are stored on people. And now, that does become a very kind of serious, complicated, but like also deeply urgent political question. And then, but you can also scale it up. I do think there's this like really intense kind of political urgency around thinking of all of this and the kind of futures of security. Like just as an anecdote, to even think about how, like, I'm just super fascinated in this, how kind of gender gets like standardized in all of this and these security technology. So I'm doing a new project on the Frankfurt airport right now, because if you fly, and this has been the case, I saw this once like 4 years ago, and I was just in Frankfurt last week, and it's still there. When you go through airport security at Frankfurt, there are about 12 or 13 monitors playing a video while you're getting ready to go through security, and it's two white German people, a man and a woman, and as they're going through security, they're just like eyeing each other and flirting. And like the guy's crotch is getting rubbed down by another security guard, the woman's breasts are getting rubbed down, but they're just kind of, making all these eyes at each other and flirting, and then they find each other in duty free on the other side. What's like so, you're watching that before you go through security, and it's like, it's kind of breathtaking, because it really is taking, like heterosexual, the promise of heterosexual romance, as a way of normalizing security. And I think there's just so many different ways, and it's also, abstractly, it's like a breathtaking art installation, because these monitors playing this video are literally stacked on top of the Pro Vision 2 body scanners. And those are the scanners that I brought up that were specifically targeting and getting transgender people taken to pre-terrorist interrogation. And so there's just kind of like so much on all these kind of different levels around futures of security, and actually who are the people that are like actually at the most risk for lots of different kinds of awful possibilities. Yeah, I think it's super important.